Welcome back to Strange Exiles, an ongoing podcast and essay series about ideas, identity, and ideology. I am your host, Bram E. Gieben. It's really nice to be back with a combined video and audio uh, essay. I've got essays on the brain because there's more writing coming on Strange Exiles soon. But today's episode is an interview with one of my favorite writers and theorists. Alex Mazey is an award-winning poet, theorist, and writer. He's a contributing researcher on sociology and postmodern theory for the international academic journal Baudrillard Now. And he's the author of several books, including Sad Boy Aesthetics, Living in Disneyland, and his debut poetry collection, Ghost Lives Cursed Edition. Alex, welcome to the show. It's very nice to have you on.
Thank you for inviting me on.
I really wanted to talk to you about Sad Boy Aesthetics, which looks at the music of Lil Peep and several other people in the kind of sad boy rap genre. I've kind of come to this music late, but become lately very obsessed with it. So I hope we get to kick about some of the ideas in there later on in the show. But it's really great to get an idea of sort of like what your approach is, where your interest in figures like Baudrillard comes from. So maybe we could start there. I understand you grew up in Oxford. Tell me a little bit more about your background. Like growing up, what were the kind of books, music, and films that first kind of captured your attention and sparked your imagination? And how did this lead to you writing poetry and theory?
Yeah, so I often think I ended up a lot of what you see today is the result of a child who was left unattended in a Borders bookshop. So in Oxford, where I grew up, there was it's not there anymore, but it was like this giant bookshop, Borders Books, and it was like over 3 or 4 floors, I think, and they had like a basement, and it no one was really sure what time it closed. It was one of those bookshops, where, and it was back when there was like a lot of seats in bookshops. They're kind of gone now. You don't see them as much anymore. But it was like one of those places where you know you could treat it like a library and get away with it. So yeah, I'm probably to blame partly for that not being there anymore. But yeah, so I just sort of like grew up a lot. I like grew up being exposed to going to these sort of like bookshops and stuff. I probably spent more time in those than I did libraries, but like I got to have. It was quite kind of cool because they got in a lot of new. They would always have like new books in. So yeah, it was kind of a lot of that stems from that. That's where I would read. It was the first time I ever read. I was like a manga or anime, stuff like that, and through reading like a adaptation of Battle Royale, they had a manga Battle Royale, and that I read, and then I kind of gradually made my way to a sort of like translated, um, like Japanese fiction, and then from there I read people like Yukio Mishima, uh, and then through him kind of Nietzsche, and that's how I kind of went into the direction of philosophy, I suppose. Just kind of natural progression towards there, and then I went, obviously a lot of people go from Nietzsche to like the existentialists, and then I was reading at the time people like Tao Lin, who I consider like he almost feels like an American existentialist to me.
Mm.
So yeah, it's just sort of like a natural progression from there, and then I suppose at some point I went to university, was exposed to more like, I suppose, people like Foucault and Chomsky, like the intellectuals that you find at university. And yeah, so it was probably from there. I suppose I read Noam Chomsky, right? And then he has the criticisms of the French intellectual scene at the time where he said, after the atrocities that were exposed of like Maoism and Marx in Russia, he kind of the French intellectual scene was in a panic mode and had to scramble to find new ideas. And I kind of, in a way, I read all of these, and then I found that Baudrillard kind of made a break from marks that felt satisfying for me. So it was just it's a case of that. But ultimately, if you get to the nitty gritty of it, I always wanted to explain why I felt, the way you feel walking through Primark after drinking like 2 Monster Energy and eating a Burger King, like how, like understanding that feeling you get. Why did I feel this way? And I feel like reading Baudrillard for me answered that question. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I came to it, really.
Yeah. And was there always that kind of direct connection of using the ideas of people like Baudrillard to understand pop culture?
In all honesty, I think it was mainly to um, to understand how I was feeling.
Hmm.
And then everything, I like pop culture. I was exposed to a lot of pop culture growing up. That's the world I come from. So it was kind of, it made sense to me to connect. Eventually, it just all like, connect the dots in a way.
Yeah. And when you started writing, did that start to kind of come out in the form of poetry, or did you sort of find the essay form first as you were at uni?
So like I as a lot of young people, right, I started writing poetry first. It's like was just the most accessible thing for me to write, and it was also a form of writing that felt so radically different from everything else you sort of grow up reading, right?
Mhm.
So I was just really I think I used poetry to help me understand how I was feeling about the world, and then naturally, like it was kind of like poetry for me was like a bit of a drug, that you like really get into, and then it sort of eventually stops working. So you have to like find a book by Baudrillard, chop it up into little bits, and like snort it up your nose or something. I just really just that's kind of how I found Baudrillard. Just I wanted like something else that was gonna resonate with me in a way poetry did, and that certainly worked.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I have a background as a performance poet myself, and I
Mm.
didn't find my way to it to kind of performing at open mics and slams and things like that till about 25.
Mhm.
I think I kind of like messed about with poetry when I was in high school, like you say, like most of us do. But then I sort of went into dance music culture. I was going out every weekend, very hedonistic, DJ and lots of stuff like that. And then around 25, I found a poetry slam that was being run in Edinburgh, where I was living at the time. And that definitely did feel like a drug. Like as soon as I was able to stand up and read words in front of an audience, it became a very addictive thing, and
Yeah.
sort of consumed my life for
Mhm.
for a decade or more. Was it the same for you? Was there an immediate charge when you went
Yeah,
from writing
absolutely.
stuff on the page to reading it?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know why anyone would be a writer otherwise, that
Mm.
you gotta be have something really sick about you to do it. And I think definitely it was like just like an addictive quality, especially yeah, I mean poetry was definitely an addictive thing. And I'll be honest, like it wore off after a while. I mean, do you do a lot of like I haven't grown up, so I still write poems.
Yeah.
Um
I'm much less prolific than I was, but I do still, go to open mics and attend performances and stuff. I've never been much of a reader of poetry in a
mhm,
way. Like that live form of it's always been the part that really kind of gets my blood going.
mhm.
Was it through going to live poetry things that you met people who would later publish you, like the guys
No,
behind Broken
no,
Sleep and Bad
I
Betty?
pretty much I'm very isolated as a writer in a way, and all of my writing has only ever been achieved through just submitting.
Mm,
I don't know people before I submit. It's never been like that for me, which is people have said it's quite strange, I suppose. But I don't think, yeah, it's never really been like that for me.
interesting, interesting. So let's talk a little bit more about Baudrillard because he's obviously, a figure that's kind of looms very large in your influences. Um, how did you get involved with the Baudrillard Now journal?
So what was weird about that is like I knew their site hadn't gone live, but somehow I knew about their site, and I had found I think like their first like issue, and they were like, "How have you found this?" And I was like, oh, I just, was on the internet, and they were like, okay, cool. And then I think the second issue was when I submitted the paper, which was like about Mark Fisher's like influence with, connection to Baudrillard, and like they liked it and they published it, and it's kind of that actually came from a book, like a failed book, that essay, like another, I had written a whole book around that. And it was like so many academic papers that I've written have just been like the condensed part of the book that I wrote, like the best bit, and then I submitted like I've submitted those. And yeah, so that's kind of, it was that simple though. There was no like magic thing that happened. It was just a case of I was consuming like as much as I could about it and reading secondary source material, and you know
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, he's a fantastic writer, and I think, as you've said elsewhere, it's almost like his theories have become more relevant over time.
mhm.
What do you think is so important about a concept like hyperreality?
What's important about hyperreality? I mean, I definitely think there's a great book, Hyperculture by Byung-Chul Han. Have you read that one? I think he does a really good kind kind of introduction to why a lot of he doesn't ever mention Baudrillard, but of course he says, it could be hyperculture is essentially hyperreality is what he says in the book. And I think that's a really good introduction to how a lot of our modes of existing today relate to directly back to these ideas. And yeah, I suppose it's just always like I always had this sense that something about the way we live, the way we conduct ourselves in life is just there's something feels wrong to me about it all, and I just always felt like um, hyperreality was quite a good answer to that for me, especially in terms of like the way it talks about the disconnect between referentials. Like we live according to certain semiotic systems that actually have no basis in anything. So it was just like, yeah, I think that's probably one of the kind of how everyone feels detached from each other and other things. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's mainly that I think that draws me to it.
Yeah,
Of course, there's a lot of other ideas in Baudrillard that is worth uh, talking about as well. Like I think things around fatal strategies and reversibility. I think that's one of Baudrillard's ideas that is probably going to be more and more relevant. Is the idea of reversibility? The idea that the maximum good can turn out to be, have a reversal quality and end up being evil in a way. So just stuff like that, I think is really, there's so many ideas that have come together in his work that I just think is great. And of course, there's the literary quality to his writing that when I started reading him, it kind of in a weird way feels like you're reading someone who's talking about our reality from another place almost. Does that make sense?
it does. Yeah, I mean, the thing that drew me in with Baudrillard was reading Simulacra and Simulation, which I think I read at a younger age than I necessarily had the equipment to understand it. But I definitely reread it when I was approaching my first book, and I think it's just grown in relevance in a world where we have online avatars that are versions of ourselves that we try and project. Obviously, as well, it's directly relevant to stuff that like Philip K. Dick was writing about in the 60s and 70s, and I think Baudrillard regarded PKD as one of the best writers out there. Um,
Absolutely.
so yeah, that's kind of what drew me in. One of your latest projects, obviously, is a series of essays on the film Galaxy Quest,
Hmm.
uh, and it's kind of a Baudrillardian examination of this movie. That was an interesting choice, I thought, to sort of apply Baudrillard to. What kind of inspired this project?
Um, just hyperfixation, really. I watched that film over and over and over again growing up, and I watched it over and over again for the essay. And I just think it really resonated with a lot of his ideas. it's a great film.
Yeah.
uh, but yeah, I think it was more, there was I had an anxiety after Sad Boy Statics, that a lot of people said the book was kind of messy and fractured and disjointed, and there was this anxiety in me that I wanted to write something a little bit more sustained and apply Baudrillard, Baudrillardian analysis to a whole, like to a one thing, you know.
Mm.
So it was kind of came the whole essay series kind of came from that, wanting to do that. It was kind of in a way, a pet project, like a personal project that I just wanted to do to show people, like to show readers and myself that I could just deal with like one project, you know, like a sustained thing. Uh,
Yeah.
and yeah, that's kind of what people see today. That's what people can go and read on the Substack today, you know.
Yeah, there's lots of fascinating stuff about the kind of layers of reality in that film, and
Hmm.
you talk about how that's kind of achieved both in terms of the aesthetic approach, the way the shots are framed, but also in terms of sort of the levels of performance of the characters, which I
Yeah,
found really interesting.
yeah, and
With
also the hammering, right, between the characters. Like you're
yeah,
never really sure. I think in that film, are they embodying the characters or not? Are they already the characters in a way?
yeah, and you found like a really surprising depth there to a film which you could watch in quite a throwaway way. You know, it's a comedy, it's a metafictional comedy. Um, do you feel like any of the other projects that have attempted to do that sort of, um, I guess, like metafictional recreation of the tropes of 60s sci-fi and Star Trek, like for instance the USS Callister episodes of Black Mirror, have they kind of come close, do you think, to sort of I don't know, like nailing the what makes Galaxy Quest such a compelling film for you?
I people always ask me about Black Mirror, and when I wrote Living in Disneyland, my first book, people said, "Oh, it's like kind of like Dark Mirror but real life." And I'll be honest with you, I think I've watched like 2 episodes of Black Mirror in my life. People early on, people said, "Oh, your writing kind of reminds me of, is it Charlie Booker
Yeah.
wrote Black Mirror?" So I find it difficult to talk about because I'm not familiar with it, mainly because it's one of those things where I think it's definitely it's a very pessimistic vision of the future, right? And it's very, it informs people's attitude about, oh well, the future should be like that then, right? You know, and I kind of, I really always hate that people expect the future to be a Black Mirror episode in a way,
Mm.
and it's like the, you know, the hyperstitional quality of that then, and the self-fulfilling prophecy of that. So yeah, I mean, I find it difficult to talk about Black Mirror beyond that. Maybe that's a bit reductive.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, the classic sort of dismissal of Black Mirror is like, what if mobile phones but bad? You
Yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah,
and it is quite prescriptive. You know, it's you know, in terms of the level of satire that's achieved there, it's
mhm.
making quite a blunt point sometimes. But
And
I
also, I
think
think
you
there's also
no
like an
carry on.
intellectualization to it as well, isn't there? Black
Mm,
Mirror? Like people think it's like big brain energy, right? And I'm not always convinced the things that present themselves as very intellectual are ever necessarily intellectual. You know, it's like the classic Zizekian reversal, isn't it? There, like what you think is intellectual isn't, and
yeah.
what isn't is. And I think that's perhaps explains my interest in Galaxy Quest too, in a way, because when, like you said, it is throwaway. You know, we're not meant. You know, Gene Baudrillard had that classic thing: we live in a world of disposable simulacra. Nothing is ever meant to be looked at with any great length or depth. It's meant to, you know, and you get that impression with like doom scrolling culture, right? You're never meant to really think about anything you're looking at anymore.
Mm.
So when in fact there's probably, it says way more about our culture than, you know, the next film that comes out, you know.
Yeah, no, that's actually that seems like a little bit of a key to your writing, I think. That idea that the if you over intellectualize something, you end up somewhere dumber. Whereas if you're looking at something that other people might consider simple, you can unpack kind of greater depth in it. I think that's definitely a little bit of a secret key to the Alex Mazey style.
You've
So,
got me. You've got me.
so I mean, we talked about I guess the quality of the prose in Baudrillard. This is something that's really interesting to me because I'm not an academic in terms of being a philosopher. I studied English literature, so I guess I'm aware of like the critical side of it. I was a music journalist, so I kind of apply those techniques when I'm writing. But the thing that I love about Baudrillard as well, but also about Mark Fisher, is the quality of the prose. I think they were both. They're both people who are able to achieve a style in that form rather than it being quite dry. Obviously, Fisher appears quite a lot in your texts too. When did you first encounter his writing? Was it sort of in terms of finding the books, or were you around to read the sort of early K-punk stuff?
No, so I was one of those classic people where I'd constantly see the word. I'd want an explanation. Again, it boils down. I wanted an explanation for certain things, and then the word hauntology kept
Mm,
being mentioned. I would listen to like when like vaporwave first came out. I remember that quite. I mean, it's kind of again, that's another one of those things people roll their eyes now when you mention like hauntology and vaporwave. But I think that that was definitely where when I listened to that music and I was like, why does this feel a certain? We listened to an album like A Birth of a New Day. Have you listened to
mm,
that vaporwave album? Like absolutely stellar album. And you want to know what is captured in that music, and I think there's like an hauntological essence there that when you're like online having a look around and people are mentioning this word, you go down the rabbit hole and you find someone like Mark Fisher, right? And so that's where I was kind of late to Mark Fisher, I think, relatively speaking. But I think what was so great about him is he was clearly writing from, I suppose, like a working classness, which I think resonates with so many people who, like you said, you don't come from a particularly academic background. Neither do I. We both did English. I did an English degree. So something I always loved in the philosophers I write, and again, this goes back to my earliest days of reading in Borders Bookshop, is I liked a literary quality to what I was reading.
mm,
So I always resonated with those thinkers who almost like embodied their philosophies in the style of their writing. And of course, Baudrillard's that classic writer where his writing causes such contention because
mm.
but it's so difficult to understand what does he mean when he says this, and I'm like, no, that is his philosophy. He wants to fight against the transparency in his language. So he's doing that through complication and ambiguity and irony, and because it's kind of, it just goes. And I'm sure Jean Baudrillard would say, I think he did in an interview, he said, a lot of this boils back to Nietzsche. About Nietzsche's project is actually one where he wants people to think for themselves, and I think that's very much in Baudrillard. He wants people to read his work and have them think. He's never really telling you what to think. And again, this is another major point of contention is in his work, because the ambiguity, it's often what do people call him, like the cool capitalist, or he's ambivalent. And it's like, no, he's not telling you what to think. He's merely telling you almost like how it is, and it's your responsibility then as a reader to think. So and again, I think you get that from Fisher too, in some ways. Certainly, have you read his Post-Capitalist Desire?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's like it's such a shame that book never. I would have loved to have read what else, his classroom lectures were just so interesting, and you get that kind of that inspiring. Okay, I want to think for myself when I read him.
Yeah, yeah, and his books are accessible as well.
Yeah,
I think that's an important thing to say is that he didn't write for sort of a narrow audience, or like, he was never preaching to the choir. I feel like he was trying to reach out a little bit further than that. But that's interesting what you're saying about sort of like embodying contradiction or tarrying with contradiction. I think that's so important in philosophical writing, and it's that ability to provoke the reader into their own thought. Guy Debord, as well, as another writer who's excellent at that. That you sort of have to sit with these quite epigrammatic phases from Baudrillard or Debord, and that's what causes you to do the thinking.
Mm,
Someone like Zizek is good at that as well, but his stuff can be quite dense and impenetrable.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
He's
that's
kind of got
fascinating.
the Baudrillard effect as well, hasn't he? His work.
Yeah,
Whereas, like as you say, Fisher's one of his, and again Byung-Chul Han, a great accessible writer, and they get like shit for it all the time, don't they? Especially like Mark Fisher will be like, critics of Mark Fisher will be like, oh, he's so simple, he's so reductive, and it's like, um, that's not necessarily always a bad thing, because people, there's the source material he's quoting from, that's, it's creating a bridge between these two things, the reader and the depth. So
yeah.
it's a really important project, I think.
Yeah, definitely agree. And I think for me, I came to Fisher reasonably early, because when he was writing on K-punk about, artists like Burial, or drum and bass, like nobody was really treating that music as anything except disposable,
Mm.
or very, very few people in the music press. He as well got to interview Burial. I think that was the first Fisher thing I read, was his interview with Burial. And given that
What a
Burial
thing,
was
yeah. What I
super
think,
secretive,
yeah.
uh, so that's really interesting. I mean, another thing you've written about in several of your projects is video games.
Mhm.
Um, how important were video games to sort of your early sense of aesthetics and how that works? And I wonder if that does that play into this new project that you've got coming up called Rival Streamer?
Um, I mean, first of all, I'd love to talk about like the burial thing. I think that's fascinating that was like the first thing you wrote about, because
Yeah, I
that's
mean that was what he was using to talk about hauntology on
Mhm.
K-punk, was the early burial stuff.
Yeah, and I loved the way Burial talked about how he himself had no connection to like rave culture. And I
Mm,
kind of, when he was saying this, and he was talking about like his older, was he talking about his uncle or brother that had got him listening to this music?
mm,
And I always kind of understood exactly what he meant, because I was too young to ever experience like that 90s rave culture. So when he was talking about that, I was like, yeah, that like nailed it on the head. That like you grew up, like I grew up with all of this, but I never had a lived experience of it. So
mm.
um, that's like such a great piece, like if of Mark Fisher's writing, I think. But in terms of the video game question, yeah, I mean, it seems almost as maybe like a young person growing up, it's just everywhere. Video games are everywhere. It's like the natural form of escapism now. I think most people probably play. I mean, it just seems demonstrable reality that most people of a certain age now plays video games more than they watch the television.
Mm.
So it's just something I've grown up with. It's something I'm like exposed to all the time. Just the nature of the culture now. So definitely, it's played in huge to the book coming out with Trick House. That kind of the video game aesthetics, the aesthetics I grew up with, the aesthetics that are that the missability of the online space as well, and how all of this comes together.
Yeah, it's funny, like people tend to think of video games as like a passive medium, right?
Mhm.
As if when you're spending time with video games, you're not using your imagination, or you're not like being sucked into the perspective of a character like you would be when you were reading a novel. But what strikes me is somebody who's played video games for a very long time. Like I can remember going to my mate's birthday party when he got his first NES, and
Mm,
everyone being obsessed with it. But I spent a lot of time as a kid playing games on my Mega Drive. Now I have a PS5 and I play a lot of games there. So I've just finished playing Cyberpunk
mm.
2077. That
Yeah.
was incredibly immersive and like a beautifully constructed game aesthetically. and I got very sucked into its world, to the point, because it's first person, where I was going around, the supermarket, and feeling like I was still in cyberpunk. So
Wow,
there's
yeah.
that level of immersion there. But I think I got that from playing, much simpler 2D scrollers as a kid as well. I think there is an act of creation involved in playing a game, because you become immersed in the perspective of the character.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I guess that's my question there, is like, does it matter that the aesthetics of video games are becoming more real, that these worlds are like more textured, more fully realized, larger? Does something like GTA um, deserve more aesthetic consideration because it's more complex? Or do you think this is fundamentally part of like what you're doing when you're playing a video game? You're directly inhabiting a character.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question in terms of does a more realistic world actually matter? Is an interesting question. I mean, I was recently playing on like a VR headset. Like my sister has a VR for work, and she let me. She's like a neuroscientist. She's very clever, and she brought home her VR headset, and I was playing that like last week. And one thing that strikes me about a virtual reality world, and you can never quite articulate it, but it feels like there's something lacking. And I can never quite, like, it's such a difficult experience to articulate, but like you're playing it, but you're just like, something is not right. There's a lack to it that
Mm,
I can never, like, I'm always trying to understand what it is a virtual world lacks. And perhaps that's something in I feel towards a lot of video games too. But maybe in a way, it's the lack that makes them appealing. I don't know. I don't know. It's something definitely worth thinking long and hard about.
yeah.
Is that quality of video game worlds that, and yeah, like I said, I sometimes wonder if it's the thing that they lack that actually makes them more attractive to us. That makes us go there and stay there, because they're ultimately they're not real life. They're not material reality.
Maybe it's something in that lack that's, that's where the imaginative work comes in, with you
Yeah.
as the player inhabiting that world. I mean, I think that's something you capture in Sad Boy Aesthetics when you're writing about Silent Hill, is
Mhm.
that those games, the gameplay was excellent, the story was interesting, but the vibe was really what stays with you, isn't it? And
Mhm.
that vibe is emerges from certain aesthetic choices in how the characters are presented, or the world that they're in. um,
Yeah, I mean, they call it the imagination gap, don't they? That space where you fill it in. And that they said when they came to making, do you remember Animal Crossing was like huge? And that was one of the main stylistic elements of that game the developers wanted to capture was the imagination gap, the space in the game and the aesthetic that the player sort of subconsciously fills in on their own. So yeah, I think that's a very good answer to it. In terms of Silent Hill, I think what's so interesting about when I wrote about Silent Hill, particularly I think Silent Hill 2, right, in Sad Boy Aesthetics, like that's like only got more intense. Like, people are obsessed with Silent Hill even more now than they were when I wrote that book. And I find that trajectory really interesting. Why? What is it about that world that's like, like in a weird way, like appealing to people?
Mm. No, that's interesting. I think you're right that it's almost become a nostalgia object now. And, certainly being a gamer who grew up in the 80s, I've got a certain amount of nostalgia for those very basic 2D games. I think like the popularity of Steam Decks and sort of emulators that you can get. I mean, even Nintendo Switch, one of the first things that you explore when you get a new Nintendo Switch is the huge catalog of early NES games,
Mm,
even some of the Sega games that are on there. I know a lot of people who are gamers, sort of my age, in their 40s, who only play the old school games because that they don't necessarily want that virtual reality full immersion experience. They want to be transported back to how it felt to play those games when they were younger. So this nostalgia plays a major fact on, impact
do,
on this too, I
do you
think.
do you think it's simply nostalgia that makes a game like, I mean, Silent Hill 2 had a remake, and it's being exposed to a new audience now. I mean, but and yet it's so um, interesting to people. The aesthetic is so interesting to people. So I don't even think we can say it's just nostalgia.
Mm,
There's something else about that world that, you know is appealing to people. Maybe it is nostalgia to, people who were there when it first came out, and like revisiting it. How have they updated the game? There's like that appeal, but I definitely feel like, um, there's an aesthetic now that transcends just nostalgia. You know,
yeah. I mean, I think it definitely does come back to aesthetics. I mean, I can remember playing GTA Vice City for the first time, and its aesthetic is inherently nostalgic. It's trying to recreate a feel and the vibe
yeah,
of a certain point in the 1980s. It obviously contains lots of kind of metatextual references to things like Scarface, Miami Vice, To Live and Die in LA. Um, but I think you can play it without necessarily knowing any of those references.
yeah. I mean, I wasn't there in the '80s, so
No.
when I played Vice City, I didn't know. I was being, again, I had like an almost hyper real experience with that. I had watched Scarface growing up, but like, and so that was my connection to the '80s. It was only through the media that I understood a game like Vice City. Or like
Yeah.
the radio on Vice City. It was the music my parents still listened to. So it was, yeah, I mean, that was how I experienced a game like that. I thought, have you played Liberty City? Did you play that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think their masterpiece, personally. I think that game has a grittiness that none of their other games really have, in a way.
Mm. Oh, we could
I
probably
mean, do
talk
you
about
agree with that?
we could probably talk about GTA all day. The one
Yeah,
for me is the one set in LA, and it's got all the kind of like classic 90s hip hop on the radio.
San
Uh,
Andreas.
San Andreas. I think I must have spent about 300 hours of my life playing that game.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
that's like one of my defining childhood games.
yeah,
For me, it was like, still remember the first time, like, you're driving a motorbike and your skill for a motorbike went up. Like, it was so, like, I don't know why I remember that, but I remember being like amazed.
I
Like,
remember
my
I
skill in
returned to
being,
that game and replayed it not that long ago, and
mm,
I was really surprised to find that like I still knew my way around the streets. Like
wow.
I knew where the guns were stashed behind the guy's house.
We
Um,
me and my friends, we still know Big Smoke's order, to
yeah,
number nines, and we go, like, we always joke, and we were actually going uh through like, a fast food, thing one day, and we asked them, like, "Do you know Big Smoke's orders?" And they were like, these poor young people were like, "What are you on about, you boomer?"
you got called a boomer. That's unacceptable. Oh, brilliant. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about Sad Boy Aesthetics. I
Sure.
absolutely loved this book. I think one of the things that made me fall in love with it is that I missed Pete when his stuff came out the first time. all of that sad boy stuff, despite being almost precision engineered to be in my aesthetic wheelhouse, I think because I was such a fan of like the lyrical hip hop of the 90s, I almost dismissed that as like disposable, lightweight, less than. And then a few years after Peeper died, I just connected to it. And it was actually Wicker Face Springs Eternal that I got into first, and then through that exploring Goth Boy Click, and then getting into Peep. And I now find his music like almost more compelling than anything else that's come out in the 21st century. I think he's, one of the great lyricists, songwriters, poets, not to mention, as you explore in the book, creator of aesthetics, that there's been. So what made you want to write a book about Peep? How did this music kind of become the focus of an extended project? And when did you first realize that you could connect that to some of your Baudrillardian analysis?
Yeah, I mean, I was just, again, it boils down to like I just got really like hyper fixated on it, and I would like listen to it all the time, and to the point where it was a weird one actually, because like after I published Living in Disneyland, I was like, well, what do I write about now? There's always that moment after you have like you write a book, you're like, fuck, I was like working on that book, and now I'm like, what now? I had something to do and something to think about, and now I'm like stuck. So I ended up just like I was listening to like a lot of music, and I joked, I think on like it was like Twitter at the time, and like I joked that like I was just going to turn my account on there into like a little Peep bot account and just like quote lyrics or something. And Aaron Kent from Broken Sleep was like, "Oh, I'm into Little Peep too," and like we got talking about it, and then like he invited like a few people into like a group chat that was meant to be like Little Peep Appreciation Society or something, and it was just a group chat where I was talking to myself and sending like I think I scared a few people, and then I was just like putting loads of music in there, and yeah, I was just like the only one talking. I think he felt sorry for me actually, and was just like, "Oh, I'm gonna have to give Alex something to do." So he was just like, "Oh, I would be interested in if you wrote a book about Little Peep." To be fair, I wrote an article. I think it was like the death drive of capitalist hyperrealism, where that was the first ever time I had like connected Little Peep into that kind of vein of thinking. And I think he might have read that and was, I would, and he was like, "Oh, I would publish a book that you wrote if, about Little Peep." And so that was like great for me at the time, because then I was like, you know what, I can write about aesthetics, I can do that. And then it was a case of just sitting down and, doing it. And in a very, I don't want to say like arbitrary way, but in a very like, I was very keen from the outset of like embodying the aesthetic as well, like writing something that not only talked about sad boy aesthetics, but also felt like it could be, it like belong there.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, I really liked when you connected back almost like the lineage of Sad Boy that leads to Peep, and you talk about like Morrissey is the original Sad Boy. I
Mhm.
think, this is one of the best points I think in the book, is that you described that Morrissey's alienation sort of depends on a sort of confrontational approach, whereby like I'm sad, but if you're not sad, fuck you, kind of thing.
Yeah,
Whereas,
there's like a narcissism to Morrissey, I think, where he's like,
yeah,
"Oh, I'm sad because everyone's not as good as me." Like
yeah,
I'm just like the
exactly.
most intelligent person in the room kind of thing. There's like it's yeah, it's like a contrived sense of like, and I suppose that's his connection to the sad boy. Because one thing I think was what I wanted to make clear with the aesthetic is it wasn't just about sadness, right? It's about the melancholic experience, which is kind of the paradoxical cohabitation of a manic and the sad, which you get in Pete, right? You get that in Little Pete. And you also get it in the progenitors. So like Young Lean, right? I talk about Young Lean being the Jing Sing strip song, kind of embodying that manic and sad, you know?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the sad boy connection when I was growing up was Kurt Cobain. He was my hookup, and
Mhm,
you know, there was like alienation, hedonism. Those were both present in Nirvana's music,
mhm,
and I guess like Lil Peep, you know, there's a big full stop at the end of that story.
mhm.
But I think, you know, there was something qualitatively different about the way Peep approached that. You know, obviously the lyrics about drugs, the lyrics about relationships, they sort of inhabit a very different space to Nirvana, which was
Yeah.
like more explicitly countercultural. Like you didn't get the sense that Peep was about being a dropout. It was more about being I guess I don't know, like alienated in a different way,
Yeah,
you
like
know?
displaced almost, like he yeah, absolutely agree with you. I wonder, is Kurt Cobain, does he fit into the sad boy aesthetic? I don't think so, you know?
Mm,
I don't think he inhabits the manic element quite like, you know, the artists I talk about, but certainly I think you're right, like, the kernel of it is there in his work. Especially, like, I love the idea of, I think Mark Fisher wrote about, Kurt Cobain, the idea that, like, Kurt Cobain figured out very quickly, I think, that nothing runs better on MTV than like people who are against MTV, right?
yeah,
I think that's a really interesting observation to make. And again, I think Fisher made some great observations about the origins of like the sad boy aesthetic in like Kanye West and Drake. You know, like this idea of like, oh, I've got everything I could ever want. I'm like I'm like in the club, but I'm sad. You know,
yeah,
so all of this is in like, you know, it's already there almost, but then I think it's the variety, the digital space and the online culture that really just like blows up like SoundCloud rap,
yeah.
and then that for me is where it began. You know.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, you know, one of the things that's kind of a thread running through so much of the Goth Boy Click and the Little Peep stuff is this idea of being in the club.
Yeah.
You know, going to the club, and you write a little bit about that being a type of liminal space. You've got to wonder though if being a bedroom rapper was actually the experience that they
Oh,
were
absolutely.
having rather than being in the club. I mean, obviously later on, once they got money and attention and fame, they would have been in those spaces.
Yeah.
But you wonder how much like the club was almost like an imagined space for
Mm.
SoundCloud rappers. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think pretty much so many of the aesthetics I'm into are based in the bedroomed life world
Mm,
that we then project. You know, and I think in Young Lean's early work, I mean, he pretty much says, you know, I was just in my bedroom making music. That, I think that's like a lyric in his first album. You know, I'm just in my bedroom making music, and this is my lean world. You know, this is the world I've created for myself, based on like the culture I'm in, and it's kind of a collage of everything that I like presented through the music. And I definitely think that's a key aspect of the aesthetic.
yeah, yeah. I'm interested in kind of like what Peep's music in particular means to you. I mean, for me, coming to it, you know, as an older guy, like necessarily older than the crowd it was aimed at, what
Mhm,
I've found, you know, in terms of sort of becoming, like you say, hyper fixated on people in the last year or so, there's so much in it that speaks to me because it's so simple. You know, a
mhm,
little bit like we were saying about Galaxy Quest. But I also find aspects of it challenging. I mean, you know, as a former cocaine addict, they talk about cocaine a lot in those songs,
mm,
and they were, you know, perhaps they were overstating how much they were into drugs, but then what happened later with Peep overdosing maybe suggests that this was an accurate representation
mhm.
of how they were living their lives. But there's aspects of it that I sort of almost find triggering as an ex-addict, like listening to that music.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, when I was doing cocaine, I wasn't going out and being very social and being in the club. I was doing a lot of cocaine at
On
home,
your own.
and yeah, on my own, and
Yeah.
feeling like the self-destructive aspects of that drug taking were the thing that I was falling in love with, and
Mhm.
thankfully managed to escape. So there's almost something dangerous for me about aspects of listening to Peep. Is
Yeah.
it similar for yourself?
I think Ken Hollings in the introduction said, "Is music something that we must learn to resist now?" And I think that's again, I think that's such an interesting observation to make. Yeah, I remember we had exchanged a few emails, and you talked about like the documentary,
Mm,
the Peep documentary, and I tried to go back and watch it, and I found it too difficult to watch.
really?
Yeah, I got like 10 minutes in, and I was like, I can't watch it because I almost feel like it's a world I've like mourned this world, and I find it now difficult to go back to in a way. And I'd have to be like some music, like you can listen to it all the time, and then other music, like you got to be in the mood for it.
Mm,
And I definitely feel that way with a lot of Little Peeps music now. I've got to be in like the big mood for it.
yeah.
Uh, Otherwise, like you said, it's sort of, I don't know. Yeah, maybe that word triggering is like a good word for it. Obviously, it's a very loaded word. But I definitely related to that.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I sort of feel the same about Nirvana. I obviously still love that music,
Mm,
but I have to be in the right headspace to revisit it because it does take me back to those, the disaffected teenage era where I
mm,
was super into it. Um, Everybody's Everything was the film that they made of it. I mean, it is an incredible documentary. The aspect of it, one of the aspects of it I found really fascinating was the narration by Lil Peep's grandfather.
mm,
He was the socialist academic John Womack. He speaks a little bit in there about Peep's desire to change the music industry, and I guess make it fairer, get people paid, make it less exploitative. Do you think there is any sort of political aspect to Peep's music that you could trace back to Womack's socialist politics?
I mean, didn't his mum pretty much on the documentary say like we hate American capitalism? I mean, that's
Yeah,
something she says. Like, and I think that's his mum, right? I mean, the woman who raised him. And I 100% think that was in him when he was making this music. I think he genuinely did want to show people how vapid the world was, and
mm,
um, I think that's what he did. I think he's incredibly emblematic person, and of course, a lot of these. Let's not forget, Juice World or XX Tentacion. These young men who they were all like 21, and that's kind of the world they occupied, right? You said about the drugs thing. I mean, we live in a time of opioid epidemic, don't we? So the idea of maybe I it's a very difficult thing to talk about in terms of like hyperculture, right? Because like you said, were they just merely showing the signs of criminality, or like were they just showing the signs of drug abuse or addiction, or were they really inhabiting those? Or are we at a point now where like we can't distinguish between the two?
mm,
Um, so I mean, one thing about the grandfather's letter, like I said, I got like 10 minutes in, and one thing that has really struck me was that opening letter that was about his grandfather talking about love, and about like what it means to be a man was to love fully.
yeah,
And I think it's really fascinating to watch the trajectory of the sad boy aesthetic, the musicians that are still alive. I mean, a lot of them, they've kind of ended up in a kind of Christian love. Like they're on 12-step programs. I think about famously, it's sort of like Suicide Boys most recently. They are, you know, preaching Christ at their concerts now. And I think that's really fascinating to see that being talked about in the documentary, this idea of like love can like save us. And then that being where the aesthetic has ended up in, you
yeah.
know?
That is interesting, isn't it? But for me, I think the thing that struck an interestingly contradictory note was that you know, Peep's lyrics engage with like a certain form of like conspicuous consumption, like Beamer Boy, you know, I need a Beamer Boy, that's a two-seater boy. You know, there's lots of stuff about labels, about cars, about you know, the trappings of capitalism. And it's such an interesting contrast with his grandfather being who he was, you know. I mean, I guess another aspects of it that I still find troubling when I listen to it is that there's a lot of misogyny in the lyrics.
Mhm.
There's a lot of stuff that feels very, very close to the edge in terms of its depictions of women. Does that strike a troubling note for you, or do you think it's part and parcel of hip hop? Or, you know,
Mm.
like how do you reconcile your
Yeah,
love of Peep's sort of tender side with that focus on, you
I
know,
mean, am I gonna indulge in like a struggle session where I have to defend a 19-year-old from accusations of misogyny? No, I think we're pretty much like beyond all that now. Um, I think it was interesting that Peep used perhaps genre conventions of hip hop, or like gangster rap, more specifically, to kind of piggyback on um, his own challenging notions of masculinity. I think that's like a paradoxical cohabitation that I find quite interesting. Um, Certainly, I remember a good case in point of this is a few years ago now. Young Lean's song, you know, Jinston Strip went viral on TikTok, like 15 seconds. And it was kind of then people, once it had gone viral, people then listened to the song to find that he had a few choice words to say about like Adele. And they were like, right, we're going to have to cancel him now. And I think he just like left Twitter. And I kind of, it always reminds me almost of like that story about, you know, when they like tried to cancel Hunter S. Thompson.
Yeah.
The joke was they tried to cancel him before they'd even got to the cancelable parts. Um, and I always sort of feel like that um, with a lot of this music. I mean, there's a lot can be said definitely about the problematic nature of a lot of this music, but I would sometimes wonder, like, it seems like I dare to say it, like intellectual low hanging fruit. Like, I mean, that is, yeah, you're right. There is misogyny present in the music, um, and that's something you can certainly highlight. But I think I always think about when again we sort of talked about this in the email exchange we had, and I went to my wife and I said, "Oh, what do you think about this?" And so like one night she put like Crybaby on like the album, and we sat and listened to it, and she said like first and foremost, I think she said, "I don't think he's a misogynist." And interestingly enough, I know more women who like Little Peep than men. That's another interesting, just anecdotal thing that I think is interesting to highlight. But she said, I think out of everything, once you listen to that album holistically, to take away from it um, the misogyny over something like the suicidal ideation of a young man is kind of a shocking assessment in a way. That's not to produce like a whataboutism, you know, argument, but like I do think that's an important thing to sort of clarify.
No, I think that's bang on the money, to be honest. The ways in which his work speaks to masculine identity, speaks to male interiority,
Mm,
speaks to, you know, aspects of like suicidal ideation. That is the important stuff. Whereas you could maybe make an argument that the misogynistic content is part of an aesthetic that's being assumed or put
yeah,
on.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, digging into the aesthetics of not just Pete, but kind of Sad Boy more generally, you make the argument that this music evokes liminal space and the spectral, and you connect that to Fisher's writing on hauntology. Do you think this is also something Peep and Co. borrowed? And where do you think it lives now in music? Like, where do you go now for your liminal chills and thrills?
Mm, um, yeah, I mean, I'm really really fascinated in liminal space still. And again, it's one of those things people talk about, and a lot of academic types kind of roll their eyes. You know, it's what more can we say about liminal space? But I thought it was really interesting that Mark Org's book, you know, Non-Places, it's just like never really gone away. Like it's
Yeah.
had such great sticking power, I think. And it clearly sticks with people. You know, it's stayed around. So I think it's not done with us yet. Whatever that's whatever the liminal is about, it's not done with us yet. But I think what I always pin this to is, you know, Baudrillard had that great where he had kind of had that dichotomy of like Disneyland and America, and I said more and more the car park that lies between the two is a kind of structuring absence almost that lies between the real world and America. I find so I think yeah, I mean liminal space is just so fascinating to me, and I talk a little bit about it in the book that's coming out towards the end of the year. But where I go for it now, that's another question entirely. I mean, I don't think I haven't found really anything that I could say I listen to now that that's it for me. The liminal Sad Boy Aesthetics was ultimately born from the liminal space. You know, I think you go to so many of that's present in so much of like Drain Gang's work. I think the liminal space, and you mentioned earlier about the idea of the consumer products as well. And I find it so fascinating, that cohabitation, especially in like Blade's music and Drain Gang more like broadly. That idea of like you can talk about like Buddhist spirituality or like network spirituality, and then also talk about you know what clothes you're wearing or like brands. That's certainly something that's stayed with, even though Blade has become more and more spiritual over the years. Like clearly, even in Cold Visions, that's like still there, and it's even the whole "I'm alone in the club staring at a wall" that's still present in the music. But I would say that's still. I listen to quite a lot of Blade. I listen to a lot of Blade still, probably more than the other artists that are sort of associated with it. So that's probably where I still get that from.
Interesting. This has been such a great conversation. We didn't get onto talking about Ghost Lives, but you know, I really like that book as well.
Thank you.
I feel like it explores kind of similar themes. Obviously, it's got some illustrations as well. It's almost like a proto-graphic novel. So I definitely recommend people to check that out. Tell us again about the next project. Give us the title and when it's going to drop.
So the title of the book is Rival Streamer, AI Slot, Brain Rot, Infinity Warriors.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And you can
Quite
find
a title.
that's brilliant. And you can find Alex's writing at alexmazey.substack.com, where you can check out the parts so far of the Baudrillardian analysis of Galaxy Quest, which we talked about at the top of the show. Highly recommend checking out his books with Broken Sleep and Bad Betty Press as well. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Alex.
Thank you for inviting me on, Bram. It's been really nice talking to you.